I'm a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun.
He's inside the school shooting at the gun!
Well, I had to do it because somebody had to do something.
After shooting in the theater, I didn't have a plan of whether to die or not.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I will be covering the tragic 1996 Dunblane school shooting. Before we start, I just want to mention that I have a membership that you guys can join to get some special perks. It's not necessary, it's just another way to support the channel. If interested, click the join button below, or follow the link in the description to join. I would very much appreciate it. Now let's jump right into the video. Thomas Watt Hamilton was born in Glasgow, Scotland, on May 10, 1952. Only 3 years later, his parents would go through a rough patch after his father began having an affair with another woman. As a result of this, the two then went their separate ways. Thomas went with his mother Agnes, who took him and went and moved in with her adoptive parents, her Aunt Catherine and Uncle James. A year later, Thomas was adopted by his mother's aunt and uncle. It was reported that Catherine and James had adopted Thomas to conceal the fact that his father had abandoned him and his mother. This was also the case for Catherine's niece Agnes. The reasoning behind them adopting her in the first place was because her mother, Catherine's sister, had been impregnated by a man who she was not married to. Ultimately, it seems the father was not around when Thomas's mother, Agnes, was born, so Catherine adopted her to avoid her sister being shamed for being a single parent. It was reported that Catherine played off the adoption as her own, by often stating to others that she was pregnant, around the time she had adopted Agnes, eventually doing the same for Agnes's son Thomas. It seems Catherine was so worried about these two incidents, and how they could affect her family's public image. So, she did what she thought she had to do, in order to maintain her family's reputation. It was during this time that Thomas's full name was changed to Thomas Watt Hamilton. Another strange fact about his family during this time is that Thomas actually grew up thinking his biological mother, Agnes, was his sister, and believed his great aunt and uncle were his actual parents. It's been widely reported that Catherine was an extremely controlling parent who would stop at nothing to keep the secrets about her family from coming out. So I'm not surprised the truth was kept from Thomas, who at a young age could have been seen as untrustworthy with the truth. This was probably just another ploy to sell the lie that he was truly her son. Anyway, Thomas would end up attending primary school in Cranhill, where it was reported that he didn't have many friends and often kept to himself due to his struggle with social awkwardness. In 1963, the family packed their things and moved to the city of Stirling. The exact reason behind the move is unknown, but it's possible that the family's secrets began to unravel at their previous location, and so they decided to pack up and leave, in hopes to keep their secrets concealed. I mean, who wouldn't notice the family with the elderly parents and the two kids who had a 20-year age gap? Keep in mind, these are my own speculations, and it's important to note that nothing regarding the reason for the family's move has ever been identified. Now in Stirling, Thomas continued primary school, where he still struggled to make friends and fit in with the rest of the students, finding himself alone for the majority of the time. He also still struggled with social awkwardness. Despite all of this, Thomas would try his best to make friends and fit in, but it seemed that nobody was interested in befriending him. Could he really have been all that bad? I mean, what was keeping all the other kids from becoming friends with Thomas? Though it's not reported anywhere, I personally believe that at some point, Thomas ultimately gave up on the idea of making friends, since he tried his best to make them, but to no avail, eventually deciding he was going to embrace his loneliness. He did, however, completely nail his schoolwork, passing all his classes with good grades. But sadly for Thomas, despite passing all his classes, throughout school, he slowly fell into a reclusive state and continued this for the rest of his school life. It's very possible that as Thomas grew older, he slowly started to realize something was off with his family, but could never really put his finger on it. I mean, if young Thomas ever learned the truth about his family, and the fact that he was being lied to, the outcome of this discovery could have negatively affected his mind's development, possibly affecting his trust issues with people later on down the line. Anyway, Thomas attended Falkirk Technical College in 1968, where he took a course for electrical engineering. He would receive several O grades in these courses, which were considered passing grades at the time. I was unable to find any evidence that suggests that Thomas ever completed his college courses, and everything points towards him dropping out. After leaving school, Thomas went and became an apprentice draftsman in the county architect's office in Stirling. I'm not quite sure where this venture led him, as I wasn't able to find anything else about it, but it appears that Thomas also abandoned this plan as well. In 1972, Thomas would open up a small shop called Woodcraft, where he would sell woodworking supplies and home goods to the local people of Stirling. It seems that this period of Thomas's life was just him trying to find a stable career path, frequently abandoning his ventures. A year later, Thomas went and joined a local Boy Scout group called the Venture Scouts, where he spent most of his free time, participating with the group during their activities. Unlike his previous ventures, something about the Scouts intrigued Thomas. Though I'm not exactly sure what it was, Thomas would remain in the Scouts for quite some time, quickly moving his way up the ranks. While in the Venture Scouts, Thomas was promoted to Assistant Scout Leader for the 4th and 6th Stirling Troop. Eventually, after proving himself capable, Thomas would be appointed the new leader of the 24th Stirlingshire Scout Group. I stated a second ago that it seemed something about the Scouts intrigued Thomas, and after doing some research, all accounts point towards Thomas enjoying his control over the kids. I'm not sure what kind of person Thomas Hamilton really was, nor do I know if all the rumors I will soon discuss are true. Everything suggests Thomas was not what he appeared on the outside, but rather a monster hiding in plain sight. Around a year into Thomas being the leader of the Boys Scout group, some shocking allegations began being brought forward. One of the major allegations was about Thomas making his Boy Scouts sleep inside his van with him during an overnight outing. Obviously, parents were extremely concerned when told about this by their kids when they returned from the trip. After many complaints and letters being filed about Thomas, he was found not suitable to act as a leader for the Scouts anymore, and shortly after, his leader role was taken from him. He was also added onto a blacklist for unsuitable applicants. That same year, Thomas's mother finally came out and told him the truth about his family's secret. I can't even imagine what kind of effect this had on Thomas's mental health. Could you imagine, after 22 years, finally finding out that your sister is actually your biological mother, and knowing that your entire family had been lying to your face, keeping you in the dark your entire life? This, and the fact that he had just been booted from the Scouts, the only thing it seemed he actually enjoyed, crushed Thomas. I mean, he probably felt like his life was coming apart at the seams. Thomas felt wronged, denying any wrongdoing, and tried his best to return to the Scouts on multiple occasions, all ending in refusal. Thomas was lost without the Scouts. It's what he loved to do. But if the accusations were true, I'm glad he was removed, and I don't feel bad for him in the slightest. During the next few years, while still trying to get back into the Scouts, Thomas had joined a rifle club, where he would feed his growing obsession with firearms by acquiring his first weapons license. Reports state that he purchased one of his first weapons on February 20th of 1977, just 6 days after receiving the weapons license. After acquiring the license, Thomas would regularly visit local gun ranges, where he would participate in competitive shooting events. It was also rumored that he was very irresponsible with his weapons when it came to following the rules of the range. He would often break the rules of the gun ranges he visited by not following the 12 bullets per minute rule, instead, carelessly rapid-firing through an entire 30-round magazine. He also acted negligent when it came to following event rules. One of the many rules was that the shooter must fire at 3 different targets back-to-back. Instead, Thomas would fire all of his rounds into a single target, confusing everyone around him. Anyway, after many more failed attempts to get back into the Scouts, Thomas grew impatient. Keep in mind, it's my understanding that Thomas was only blacklisted from joining that specific Scout group again, but not totally banned from starting or joining other groups. So he decided he would do anything to be a Scout leader again. So in 1981, he started up his own group called the Dunblane Rovers. The scary part about this group was that Thomas had total control over the adults who came and went, not to mention all the kids who joined. This terrifying reality meant Thomas was free to do whatever he wanted with the kids, with no staff to stop him. Over a course of many years, Thomas would start up several more groups, advertising them by leaving flyers at schools and houses in his area. The flyers listed some of the activities the boys could partake in. The list included football, gymnastics, camping, and other games. I'm not too sure if shooting firearms was listed on these flyers, or if the parents knew their children would be handling weapons. But according to reports, Thomas trained the kids to shoot with his own personally owned weapons. With Thomas not being a licensed trainer in all areas, he would seek out and hire certified people for certain activities that legally required one. Despite doing this, Thomas would only briefly hire certified staff members, using their certification for a short period of time before getting rid of them entirely, and continuing to teach and supervise the activity on his own. I read about 3 different times where Thomas had been questioned by a parent about his qualifications, regarding the teaching of kids in some of the group's activities. I wonder if hiring the qualified staff was a way to ensure his group was safe from attracting too much attention and being shut down. Moving on, over the course of many years, up until the day of the attack, Thomas would set up and run a total of 15 different boys' clubs, all of which were initially very popular with kids when they were first established. But like his time before in the Scouts, concerned parents started to notice his odd behavior with the boys and his unhealthy obsession with them. Not long after, rumors began to spread around town, and parents started pulling their kids from Thomas's groups. Around this time, Thomas adopted the name Mr. Creepy around the town. In 1983, Thomas blamed these rumors as the cause for his small shop to close down. Of course, there could have been many other contributing factors, but Thomas chose to blame it on the community's accusations. Thomas would continue to go through more hard times in 1987, when his adoptive mother passed away, leaving him to live alone with his adoptive father, whom he apparently did not get along with. Around this time, a boy who was sent to one of Thomas's 2-week-long summer camps was picked up by his mother, Doreen Hager, only a week into the trip. While visibly distraught, he told his mother that Thomas had taken away all of the boys' clothes and forced them all to wear only swimming trunks before taking them out on the lake in a boat. It was reported that there was actually evidence from this ordeal inside Thomas's home. Thomas had taken multiple pictures of the boys in their swimming trunks, and reports state that the images were, quote, covering the walls of Hamilton's home, unquote. Continuing on, Doreen Hager was told by her son that at some point during their sail, Thomas had thrown him out of the boat and into the lake. It's worth mentioning that Doreen's son had a severe fear of water, but thankfully, he was wearing a life jacket. What shocked her even more was when her son told her that Thomas would undress and have the group of kids rub suntan oil all over his body for him. Obviously, this is not normal behavior at all, and Doreen was understandably pissed. When Doreen arrived at the lake to pick up her son, she noticed right away that the camp had none of the facilities that Thomas told her it would have. Before leaving with her son, Doreen confronted Thomas and told him that she would be reporting his camp for not having the necessary facilities, along with the suntan oil story, to the police. I can only imagine that this threat had Thomas furious, making him feel as if he was in danger of losing this scout group and being banned from starting up anymore. It turns out that Doreen Hager meant business because she went and reported Thomas to the authorities, hoping that Thomas's club would be investigated and terminated. Doreen relayed information about Thomas to an inspector by the name of Keenan. I'm not sure what the exact outcome was, but whatever transpired didn't stop Thomas from running his clubs. I did read one article that stated that there just wasn't enough evidence to keep him from starting or continuing his clubs. A little while later, how long I'm not too sure, Thomas was furious over being reported to the police, and he set out towards Doreen Hager's home to confront her. Doreen recalls the moment Thomas showed up to her home in a van, slamming it up on the curb. She states, quote, he rolled the window down and he said, I hear you have been making statements about me to Keenan. I said, that's right. I said, I just told him about the state of the camp, how you treated the kids, and my own personal opinion of you. And at that, he leaned forward. His face was all puffy. When he used to get in a rage, his face would go puffy, would blow up and really bulge. He leant forward, and I thought he was going to start the engine up after the mouthful I gave him. and the next thing I heard a click of metal hitting glass. And I looked down, and there was a bit of metal there. It didn't register with me right away, and I just looked at him, and he said, "My friends don't like it." I looked again, and that is when I realized that it was a barrel, and I said, "Dinny, point that effing thing at me. I will ram it down your throat." He just got really bulging and never said a word. Off he went. I'm not sure if Doreen ever reported this incident to police, but it seems she had no idea how serious this event was. Anyway, with no real action being taken by the police, Doreen and a friend decided they would take matters into their own hands, devising a plan to get back at Thomas for what he did with the kids. So on May 16th, 1989, when Thomas was on his way out of an activity involving his group, Doreen and her friend ran up to him with 2 buckets filled with a disgusting concoction of liquid manure, suntan oil, flour, and fish manure. The pair lifted the buckets high and splashed both of them onto Thomas, before kicking him in the butt and stating, quote, "I'm sorry I couldn't get a wee boy to rub it in," unquote. Doreen was hoping that Thomas would press charges for the assault, so the authorities would have to press forward and investigate the cause of the incident. But to her surprise, Thomas had no intention of causing any more unwanted attention and never pursued any legal action. Continuing on in 1991, another report was made by Paul Hughes, who was then Detective Sergeant with the Central Scotland Police. The reports were regarding Thomas's behavior with the many boys whom he had come in contact with during his clubs. Hughes strongly recommended that Thomas should be prosecuted over the conduct that allegedly took place in his camps. He also tried to persuade his superiors to revoke Thomas's firearm license, but as we will soon find out, never actually happened. Just the next year, in 1992, a firearms officer was sent to assess Thomas's gun license, and when conducting the evaluation, the officer stated that he found Thomas to be polite enough, but a bit strange overall. Thomas showed no obvious signs of being a threat and seemed like an all-around normal guy, so his paperwork was signed off and renewed. In 1995, Thomas had begun to notice the obvious decrease in boys attending his clubs, and one of the reasons that he believed this was happening was because he thought the kids were distracted with other things and were not determined or motivated enough to continue the club activities. But in reality, most parents became aware of how Thomas was operating his groups, like a control freak who loved to abuse his power over the kids, not to mention the rumors circulating about him being inappropriate with the kids. The clubs were described as militaristic, with Thomas regularly overworking the boys and enjoying his time as the dominant force. Once Thomas became aware of the rumors, he again felt like he was being targeted by the community. In Thomas's eyes, he felt wronged when he was first blacklisted from the Scouts, and also when people tried to get his club shut down, along with being branded a pervert all over the town. It seemed that no matter what Thomas did, he was unable to escape these rumors being made about him. Obviously, Thomas was up to no good if rumors kept surfacing about him, but it's possible that Thomas didn't see a problem with what he was doing. It's also crazy to me that Thomas was never arrested for anything the rumors claimed. I mean, was there not enough evidence? Despite numerous reports and police getting involved, Thomas played the victim card every time, with no real action being taken by police. Were these rumors true? Or was Thomas actually the victim of misinformation? Anyway, as more stories started coming to light, even more parents started pulling their children from the clutches of Thomas. Like earlier stated, Thomas had already started to notice a huge decrease in kids attending his groups, but now, the attendance was at an all-time low. I would just like to quickly mention that Thomas owned multiple firearms during this time, and each of them required its own license, so it's not exactly clear which specific license was being renewed previously. But once again, one of Thomas's licenses was due for a review. Thomas was evaluated and assessed by another officer in 1995 at his home. The officer claimed that he did not feel comfortable in Thomas's presence, and even felt at one point that Thomas tried to intimidate him by flashing a holstered revolver at him. But unfortunately, despite getting a bad feeling from Thomas, the officer chose to renew his firearms license, as he did not have probable cause to deny the renewal. The officer later stated that he was glad to leave the home and get out of the company of Thomas Hamilton. Moving on, I'm now going to touch on Thomas's ammo purchases, which appear to paint a picture of premeditation and deliberation. Thomas's firearm certificate well documented all of his firearm-related purchases, including every ammunition purchase made by him. According to the logs, there was a significant gap between purchases from 1987 all the way to September of 1995. The purchases started back up with a huge spike between September 22, 1995 and February 27, 1996. The log shows he purchased a total of 1,700 9mm rounds and 500 .357 Magnum rounds, along with a Smith & Wesson revolver and a Browning pistol. It's very possible that Thomas had begun to stockpile more ammo during this time, in preparation to exact his revenge on the community who he felt wronged him. Keep in mind, this is just my own speculation, and there is no real way of knowing the truth, but I would like to know your opinions down below. On January 26, 1996, Thomas started writing a letter to the teachers of Bannockburn and Dunblane primary schools. In the letter, Thomas seems angered with the idea of teachers and administration spreading rumors about him all over the school. He writes to the regional education convener, Dr. Robert Ball, stating, quote, "At Dunblane Primary School, where teachers have contaminated all the older boys with this poison, even former cleaners and dinner ladies have been told by teachers at school that I am a pervert. There have been reports at many schools of our boys being rounded up by staff and even warnings given to entire schools by head teachers during assembly. I have no criminal record, nor have I ever been accused of sexual child abuse by any child, and I am not a pervert. I have always run my clubs in a fair, proper, and competent manner, and ensured that no child or parent has any proper or legitimate complaint. Nevertheless, this defamation coming from the respected source of local primary school staff has caused untold problems everywhere within the region and beyond." Unquote. I'm going to quickly add in a small story here that supports the idea of Thomas's dramatically deteriorating mental health around this time in his life. This story comes from one of Thomas's closest friends, a man by the name of James Gillespie. In late January of 1996, James had gone over to Thomas's home, like he would normally do. Thomas would regularly show James his weapons, along with videotapes of some of his scouts playing football or even doing gymnastics. Anyway, on this day, while Thomas was cleaning his guns, he and James struck up a conversation. The conversation shifted to the topic of Thomas's scout clubs and whether or not James would send his own children to attend the clubs if he had any. James told Thomas that if he had any children, he would not allow them in his clubs, and this angered Thomas. Out of anger, Thomas raised one of his revolvers to James's head and pulled the trigger, sending the hammer of the weapon crashing down with a loud click. This frightened James, as you would imagine. He shouted at Thomas, calling him a, quote, "stupid bastard," unquote, before throwing his cup of coffee at him and storming out of the house, never speaking to Thomas again. In February that same year, Thomas renewed another one of his weapon licenses, which one I'm not exactly sure. A month later, on March 7, 1996, in a last-ditch effort, Thomas wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth II. In the letter, Thomas wrote about his time in the Scouts, him being labeled a pervert, being unfairly banned from the Scouts, and demanding a resolution to the damage the rumors have caused him. The note reads, quote, "Your Majesty, I understand you are patron of the Scout Association, and in that capacity, I would like to make you aware of my long-standing complaint against the Scout Association. Over 20 years ago, as a young man of about 20 years of age, after my time as a venture scout, I was asked to become a scout leader, which I did with enthusiasm and in a fair and competent manner. I was at that time, however, somewhat disillusioned with the general management which existed in this district at that time. After a period of a year, I was offered a better position by District Commissioner J. Don within the association in Mr. Don's nearby district of Hill Foots, which I accepted. However, my transfer was refused by Scottish Scout headquarters without any explanation. DC Don approached my previous DC, Mr. R. Duchars, and as a result of this, reported in confidence to me that Mr. R. Duchars was attempting to have me branded as a pervert. When Mr. Don demanded justification of this, Mr. Duchars' only response was that I was friendly with the boys. Mr. Don remarked that a scout leader was supposed to be friendly with the boys, and as a conclusion, Mr. Don reported to me that he had nothing on me, but he may cause me considerable damage if unchecked. In what I consider to be a breach of natural justice, Mr. R. Duchars then submitted a confidential report on me in line with the policy organization and rules of the association. I know that no child has ever made any complaint of a sinister or sexual nature against me, but DC Duchars, together with the ADC Mr. Samuels and the GSL Mr. Mackenzie, visited and interviewed every child in my old group, including especially everyone who had been a member and left. Nothing of a sinister nature came to light. My attempts to approach Scottish Scout headquarters were ignored, and I could get nowhere since I was blocked from all angles. As time passed, numerous and various reports were received that Mr. Duchars was passing information within the District Scout area, that I was a pervert, which was passed to the public in an underhand manner. This has probably been the most damaging of all, on the part of the police and council. I have been involved with the organization of boys' sports clubs for over 20 years, and the rumors circulated by officials of the Scout Association have now reached epidemic proportions across Central Region. As well as my personal distress and loss of public standing, this situation has also resulted in loss of my business and ability to earn a living. Indeed, I cannot even walk the streets for fear of embarrassing ridicule. All of this and more has been caused by the maladministration of the Scout Association and their denial of natural justice and duty of care. I turn to you as a last resort and am appealing for some kind of intervention in the hope that I may be able to regain my self-esteem in society. I am, your obedient servant, Thomas W. Hamilton." Unquote. Thomas would never receive a reply from the Queen, and I'm not too sure if he ever got a response from anyone he sent letters to. But just a week or so after sending his letter to the Queen, Thomas would exact his revenge by targeting one of the many schools that he felt wronged him, Dunblane Primary School. Now, let's move on to the day the shooting took place. Wednesday, March 13th, 1996, began like any ordinary day for the town of Dunblane. Many residents were starting their busy work days by first getting their kids ready for school, following their usual routines. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to the parents of many children, a madman by the name of Thomas Hamilton, who was able to squeeze through the cracks of law enforcement for many years, chose this day as the day to initiate an act of pure violence, seeking revenge for what he felt was the community intentionally targeting him. Around 8:15 in the morning, Thomas loaded his van with his 4 personal handguns, along with 700+ rounds of ammunition for the weapons. Around this same time, he was seen by a neighbor as he scraped ice off of his vehicle in preparation for the 5-mile journey to Dunblane. Some sources state that Thomas and his neighbor actually struck up a small conversation, but none of them really went into detail on what was said during this alleged conversation. Anyway, Thomas embarked on the trip, arriving at Dunblane Primary School around 9:30 a.m. The school had just finished a grade 1, 2, and 3 assembly just a few minutes prior to his arrival, and all students were now back in their classrooms. When Thomas arrived, he parked his van in the parking lot just north of the school, near a telephone pole. He exited the van and walked to the pole, where he used a pair of pliers to cut the wire, effectively severing the telephone connection of a few neighboring homes. I'm not sure if Thomas thought he was cutting the phone lines of the school, but it is very possible. After equipping himself with the 4 handguns he brought with him, all of which had a holster of their own, and a pair of earmuffs, Thomas made his way to the main entrance of the school. There are some conflicting reports regarding the exact timeline of the shooting itself, and I just want to mention that official police reports have been sealed for 100 years to protect the names of the children involved, so not many details are publicly available, but I tried my best to gather the most credible and accurate details of this case possible. I would also like to quickly mention that many people speculate that officials are trying to cover something up in the reports by enforcing the 100-year ban instead of just redacting certain information from the reports. Let me know how you feel about the ban. Continuing on, arriving back to the gym for their PE lesson was a class of 28 kids and teacher Gwen Mayer. Mayer was accompanied by a supervisory assistant, Mrs. Mary Blake, and PE teacher, Mrs. Eileen Harold. Mrs. Mayers was about to be dismissed so she could attend a meeting elsewhere. The 28 students were all seated in the middle of the gym, while teachers Mrs. Harold and Mrs. Mayer were talking. Out of nowhere, the sound of 2 loud pops rang out from the assembly hall. The teachers all turned and looked towards the door of the gym facing the hall. That's when they witnessed Thomas Hamilton come through the glass door and casually walk into the gym with a gun in his hand. Thomas quickly assessed the occupants of the gym and raised his weapon. Without warning, Thomas let off 29 shots in rapid succession, striking all 3 faculty members, injuring multiple kids and killing 1 student with this volley. Mrs. Harold was shot multiple times and managed to flee out of the gym and into a storage area, where a group of kids fled with her. Mrs. Blake was also shot in the process of escaping, fleeing into the same storage area as Mrs. Harold. Many students also followed. Mrs. Harold later stated, quote, "I couldn't move my arms and I desperately wanted to pull a mat or something over us to protect us. As it was, I can only describe us as being like sitting ducks. The children were at our feet, and one was lying over my legs. I could see bullet wounds in their legs. The children were screaming, and the other teacher and I put our fingers to our lips to tell them to be quiet. One boy had been saying over and over what a bad man he was. I was extremely frightened that he might come back to the cupboard and finish us off," unquote. Sadly, Mrs. Mayer was shot multiple times and was killed instantly where she stood. It's reported that Gwen Mayer was killed while trying to save her students from Thomas. Let her be remembered for her last heroic actions of that day. The children in the gym all began to scream in horror at what was occurring. Thomas then walked further into the gym, firing another 14 rounds, before making his way to the center of the gym, where a large group of kids were still laying on the floor. Some reports state that at least 1 student played dead during this time and survived the ordeal. Thomas proceeded to stand over the kids as he raised his weapon and fired shots at them. He fired a total of 16 point-blank shots during this time. As Thomas was in the process of shooting, a student who was outside the building on the west side of the gym heard the loud commotion coming from inside. The student was in the middle of acquiring a pair of scissors from another classroom and was on his way back to his own room when he peered into one of the gym's windows to see what the noises were and saw a man with a weapon firing at the kids. Thomas glanced over and saw the child in the window looking at him and quickly raised his weapon up and fired at him, sending the kid running off after being hit by the flying glass. After this, Thomas made his way towards the south exit of the gym, where he fired 24 more times in multiple directions. He then exited the gym from the southern exit and continued firing at 2 outer building classrooms that were occupied at the time. A teacher by the name of Mrs. Grace Tweddle was shot in the head at this moment, but luckily the bullet only grazed her, and she survived the ordeal with minor injury. After hearing the gunfire and realizing the immediate danger they were in when she saw Thomas shooting, teacher Mrs. Catherine Gordon ordered her entire class to get on the floor. This action most definitely saved lives, because just a moment after doing so, Thomas turned his attention towards the windows of her classroom, discharging 9 shots through them, nearly missing the students. Thankfully, nobody was harmed in this room. Thomas Hamilton then turned around and made his final walk back into the gym. There, he fired his last rounds inside. Reports state that there was a total of 58 gunshot wounds on all the victims inside the gym, 26 of which were fatal on their own. Anyway, feeling accomplished, he dropped his pistol to the floor, simultaneously unholstering his .357 revolver. While assessing the carnage he had just caused, the moans and the screams of terror, Thomas put the revolver into his mouth and fired, ending his own life. The event was finally over, but sadly, 17 innocent lives were lost in this tragedy, and the community was hit hard with the news. Thomas had fired 105 rounds and ended 17 lives plus his own within a 4-minute time span. Police arrived on scene at about 9:50 a.m., where they discovered the horrific bloodbath. Police painstakingly cleared the school, evacuating everyone and rendering aid to wounded individuals inside. After some investigation, Thomas was quickly identified as the suspect. With official police reports being locked away for 100 years, this part of the case is a bit challenging to document, to say the least. I mean, there is almost nothing available as to the investigation into Thomas after the shooting occurred, with the only publicly available motive being the one we have already covered. The idea of him feeling so ruined by the community, to the point where everything in his life felt like it was being destroyed. This hopeless feeling pushed him to a dark place where he no longer cared about living and only wanted one thing before he passed on: revenge. As I mentioned previously, before Thomas made his way inside the school, There was an assembly occurring right outside the gym door. There were 250 participants in attendance. If Thomas would have arrived just 15 minutes prior, all 250 occupants of the assembly would have been directly in his path, meaning that the death toll of the shooting would have been catastrophic. I personally believe that this was his initial attack plan, so I did some digging into this idea and discovered a report that supports it. The reports state that on March 7th, Thomas was in the middle of hosting one of his clubs when he approached one of his members who attended Dunblane Primary. He apparently asked the child where the main entrance to the school was and how he could get to the gym from there. He also asked about when the assemblies usually start and how he could find the assembly hall and stage from the main entry. The young boy answered every question for Thomas as accurately as he could remember. Luckily, though, the boy accidentally gave Thomas the wrong time, stating 9:30 as the time the assemblies start, rather than the real time, 9 a.m. That's right, 9:30, around the exact time that Thomas had arrived at the school that day. Do you think this was his original plan? With the supporting reports, I believe it is plausible. In the aftermath of the shooting, a few residents started up a campaign called the Snowdrop Campaign, named after the only flower in bloom during the time of the shooting. The campaign pushed many citizens to sign a petition calling for a ban on the private ownership of handguns. The petition would receive an enormous 750,000 signatures. Ultimately, the campaign would force the decision for the passing of the Firearm Amendment Act in 1997, banning all handguns above .22 caliber, effectively restricting secure gun clubs to only smaller caliber weapons. After the law passed, nearly 160,000 handguns were turned into law enforcement, and with that, the campaign goal was reached, so the Snowdrop campaign disbanded soon following. Now, I would like to dedicate a portion of the video to the victims who lost their lives that day. I was not able to find much information about most of the victims of this case, most of which were 5 to 6 years of age, other than their teacher. But even if I couldn't find any information on a victim, I will still be putting their picture up and giving them a moment of silence. Victoria Clydesdale was from Drummond Rise and loved gym lessons. According to her obituary, she was supposed to stay home the day of the shooting because she had a rash, but begged her mother to let her go to school that morning. Her mom later stated, quote, "She said 6 bye-byes to me as she went down the path to school. Now I'll never see her again," unquote. Lee McMaster, Victoria's brother, recalls the last time he saw his sister alive. Quote, "It started off like any other day. When we reached the school gates, Victoria asked me for a kiss goodbye. Being 15 at the time, it wasn't a cool thing to do, so I sort of brushed it off. But she kept on at me about it, so I promised I'd kiss her at home later. Then she just trotted off to the playground." Emma Crozier lived in Montrose Way. She was described by a neighbor as being lively, charming, and bright. She was baptized with best friend Joanna Ross, who was also killed in the shooting. Reverend William Gilmore later stated, quote, "I recall on Sundays that Emma and Joanna would sit together at the front pew, bobbing around and chatting," unquote. Emma and Joanna would be buried together 5 days after the shooting. Charlotte Dunn was from Springfield Terrace and had just moved to the area of Dunblane a year prior to the shooting. Despite being new to the area, Charlotte quickly became friends with a girl at Dunblane Primary School named Melissa Curry, who was also killed in the shooting. Charlotte loved teddy bears. Her grave is marked with a stone in the shape of a panda. David Kerr was from Menteith View. A local priest by the name of Canon Basil O'Sullivan told mourners, quote, "We thank our Heavenly Father for giving us such a beautiful, beautiful boy," unquote. Sophie North was from Bridgend and was a bright and popular girl. She was described as a lively, inquisitive girl with huge brown sparkling eyes and a cheeky grin. March 13th, 1996, was like any other day for Sophie. She ate her breakfast, but her dad later recalled that she did not give him a kiss before leaving for the kids' club that morning. Gwen Mayer grew up in Great Harwood, a small town in northeast Lancashire. Her daughter later stated, quote, "I have such happy memories. She was such a vivacious, creative person who loved making people happy. She and my dad, Rodney, would hold dinner parties for their friends, and she loved writing poems for people. She always knew how to make someone feel special," unquote. Those were the victims I could find minimal information about. These are the victims I could find nothing about, so let's give them a moment of silence while we remember them. Mahari Isabel McBeath, 5 years old. Brett McKinnon, 6 years old. Abigail Joanne McLennan, 5 years old. Emily Morton, 5 years old. Melissa Helen Curry, 5 years old. Kevin Allen Hassel, 5 years old. Ross William Irvine, 5 years old. John Petrie, 5 years old. Joanna Caroline Ross, 5 years old. Hannah Louise Scott, 5 years old. Megan Turner, 5 years old. At the end of the day, this shooting remains one of the deadliest in Britain's history. Never let the victims be forgotten. I would like to thank all of you for watching until the end of the video. Thank you to all my members as well, and please make sure to check out my membership if you are interested in being a part of that as well. And with that said, thanks again. Until next time, stay safe out there.